Hey folks, welcome back to DJ Tutorials. Today we're going to be looking at a new contender in the Caustics area, primarily looking at the Octane Render for Blender add-on, which is free. And if you go to my YouTube channel, the link's going to be down in the video description. If you don't know anything about Octane Render, you can check out my videos there. I have a download and installation video, and I have a bunch of other beginner tutorials as well. So you can see here that it covers all of the basics of what the engine is and everything like that. And while you're there, please go ahead and hit that like button and the subscribe button if you could. That really helps me out. Also, in the video description, you're going to find a link to my Gumroad where you can download both of the project files that we're going to be using for this tutorial. So you can see right here, Octane Caustics scenes, where I have a couple example images here of what you're going to get inside the package. So if you really want to see some of the more advanced stuff that I show you in this video, you can download those project files and check those out. And for those of you who want to go above and beyond and become a patron, please check out my Patreon, also in the video description, where you can see the different membership levels and what you get each month. And without further ado, let's get started with this tutorial. Now, what I would like to do before we begin the proper tutorial is I want to just show you some of the things that I have done in this project file that's available on Gumroad. So there's a couple different scenes here. It's really the same scene, just a couple different setups with some different lighting and things like that. So you can see here, we have just a standard vase with some water in it and stuff like that. So you can see what the caustics look like there. We also have this one right here that shows how you can get some really cool dispersion effects with a ball like this here. So you could see that. And sometimes what you have to do is you have to go between the solid mode and the rendered mode just to make sure that you get the right sort of rendering that's done. So you can see that there's the really cool dispersion effects happening there. And we also have this one right here that is a diamond. So if I select the other camera that I used for this particularly interesting rendered scene, as you can see, I sometimes, or you will have to sometimes reset the render a couple times to get the right caustics look there. You can see that what I've done here is I have an IES light texture that's shooting a ray of light directly at this object here. And that's kind of how I've set this up in a couple different of the scenes. We have a IES light texture for the dispersion, the two dispersion ones, the ball and the diamond. And then for the picture, I have used just a standard lighting setup with just a primitive light right here. And it kind of just shows some general setups and how you can set up your scene with a environment texture, and it's also going to give you the node setups for a bunch of different materials and some things like that. So if you're interested in looking at some of these scenes, quote unquote, finished, to give you an idea about what you can do inside of Octane Render, I do recommend that you download this project file. I'm going to give the link down in the video description so that you can check that out. So to begin the tutorial proper, what we're going to do is we're just going to go over here and make sure that you, in your default scene, you change this over to Octane Render. And I'm not going to show you from the very, very beginning on, how to download it and install it and all that kind of stuff. I do have other video tutorials on that. You could check in the, up in the top right corner, you should see a card come in, and I'll put the link down in the video description so you can check it out. I have the keyboard over here so you can see my key presses or key commands. Let's get rid of that timeline down there. And what we're going to do is I'm just going to start by saving this project. And let's just take a look and see what it looks like when it's in rendered mode. So we could just take a look at this. This is what the general scene looks like. We're going to change the Octane environment over here. I'm going to change this to planetary. And this allows you to sort of like choose the direction and all that kind of stuff for the lighting. And one thing that you'll want to do is if you run into some issues, some really weird sort of stuff, I'll just sort of show you what I'm talking about really quick. If I go into the shader editor, you can see there's the materials right here. If I hit Shift A to add, you can see down here there's all of these Octane material nodes. If all you see is input and output, I noticed that there's an issue with the ProRender add-on where I had to actually turn that off for this to work. There was some sort of like, I don't know, competing issue inside of Blender itself. So I had to go into preferences, I had to find ProRender and turn that off. So if you do run into that issue where you're only seeing the input and output, do that, and you might need to save your settings and then reopen. Otherwise, when you hit rendered, it might crash or something. It's just a weird anomaly that happened with Blender, and it's just one of those things that happens sometimes. So now that we have that over there, let's just add a simple ground plane And I'm just going to scale this up like 20 times. Control A to set that scale. And we'll just move that cube up a little bit. Actually, let's have it float a little bit above. And I'm just going to rotate it kind of a little bit wonky. And for caustics, this can work, that's fine, but let's add a bevel here. So you can see there's a little bit of a bevel right there. And what that's going to do is when we actually turn the caustics on, we'll get some more interesting effects. And then we're going to sort of stack another bevel on top of that to just sort of soften these edges here, kind of like that. And you can add some segments, but I think that this adds for more realistic caustic effects because in real life, things aren't a 100% harsh angle. So you can add some segments here if you'd like, and then set that to auto smooth if you'd like. So now that we have our cube here and our ground plane, let's take a look at the rendered view and let's start adding some materials. So we're going to pull this over and change this to the shader editor here and just take a look at some of the stuff. So the universal material is pretty daunting. There's a whole bunch of stuff here. It's basically a super huge version of the principled BSDF shader for the Cycles engine. And I'm not going to go into the details on all this. I do have other videos. Again, just check out the links down in the video description if you really want to know how to use a lot of this stuff. But what we're going to do is we're just going to delete that and we're going to add the specular material right here because it's a lot simpler to look at. And there it is right there. You can see that it's a glass object. And let's select the floor, go over to our materials over here, or you can click the new right here. Let's just call this ground. Let's name these. And let's call this one glass, okay? So on the ground here, let's delete the universal, and we're just going to make this a diffuse material. We don't want anything too fancy. All we really need to see is the caustics effect as it hits the floor. So we're just going to make this a little bit darker. And that's going to be okay. So let's click on the light here. And the interesting thing about how Octane deals with lights is that you have to use these nodes. So if we select this right here that says use nodes, or you select the checkbox there, it will create this right here. But sometimes this doesn't work right with the default lighting here. So I'm going to delete that and we're going to add a new light. And let's actually move this over so you don't get confused with the key commands down there. So let's just add a sphere light, okay? You can see that it's a mesh. And if we grab that and move it up here and click use nodes, and let's take the texture right here and move this all the way up to white. And then the power, let's change this to a 1500 or something. And you can see that now we have a proper light source. Now, usually this would be when I start to add an IES light texture to the power or something like that. And I do have that node set up in the project file downloads, but I'm not going to go into that too much on this tutorial. So you can see here that we already have some caustics here. But if we select the glass and center to our nodes over here, you can see right here there's this that says allow caustics. So let's click that on. And we'll notice that not much changes. And if we take the light and we move it closer, again, not much is really changing. You can see that there's something happening here as far as some sort of caustics being rendered right in here, but it's not super great. So what we need to do is we need to go over to the render properties. And there's two ways to do this. You can do this kernel node tree, which is cool. I played around with it. But for everybody else, I think that the classic property panel is probably the easiest to look at. And I just want to talk really briefly about some of these kernel types. So if we click on default here, you can see that it's basically just a very simple set of rendering. We don't really have too much going on as far as caustics. This is really done for speed. So keep that in your back pocket when you're doing anything that, you just need to have a really, really quick render. There's not too much as far as complication is concerned, or you're using a very low powered computer and you can't handle some of the much more complex stuff as far as, animations are concerned, okay? So let's then change this back to the path trace. And you can see there that we do have some of those caustics that are being rendered, but it doesn't really look great. So the one that we really want to look at is this right here that's called photon tracing. So let's click that on. And you can see right away that we're starting to see more interesting stuff happen. You can see that there's this line that comes across here, and we can see the caustics through the actual glass. And if we pull this closer, you can see that it increases the amount that we're seeing there, and you can even see the reflected light all the way over there. And if we move it to the other side, or move it within the object, or move it above, you can see that it has some very different effects, and you can see that line that's being traced there. So what's really important to think about and remember when you're dealing with caustics is you need to remember that these sorts of caustics, and this is the same thing I say when it comes to LuxCore, the positioning of your light, whether it's close or farther away, and the size of your light, so the radius size here, and then we can also do a really cool scaling thing inside of the scene right here, and also the power here. All of those things are going to change how the caustics are reacting. So if we scale inside of the scene here, and you can see that this is getting bigger and smaller, let's take the power and let's make this like 500. If I scale this up, you can see that the light is getting brighter, and the way that the shadows are being cast and the way that the caustics are being calculated, it changes. And if we scale this down, 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 super tiny, you can see that it changes as well. So the intensity of the light and the shadows are going to change depending on that scaling. I'm just going to undo those. And over here we have the light radius. So if I change this to a 0.1, for example, and let's just move closer here so you can take a look at the shadow. If we take this and we move this to a 0.01, you can see that the edge is very, very sharp. That shadow is now super, super sharp, and the caustics are very sharp. So if you're doing something that needs to have very sharp edges because it's stylized or it's just something that you're trying to do for your scene, you'll want to make sure that the radius of that light is really tiny. And you can see that it got super small, okay? But what's cool about this, and it's something that I can notice that's inside of Octane, but not in a lot of other engines, is that we can actually scale this up after you've changed that size of the radius there. So you can increase the intensity and sort of blur those lines a little bit more by scaling it up there. And you can see that that edge got a little bit softer. So just keep in mind that the scaling here is not reflected in the radius here. So it's sort of like, is changing this value, like when you're scaling it here, it changes technically what the radius is, just not as intense as if you change this, by changing that 5 times or something. So it's very important just to make sure that as you're building your scene, if you're noticing that the edges are too sharp or too soft and that the caustics aren't showing up the way that you like, you need to adjust that radius there. But it's also about this intensity, right? So if we change this to a 15, thousand or something, and then change the radius size to a 0.005 and move it closer here, you can see that it's having a little bit of a different effect. And what happens a lot is that when folks start building these scenes and they really want this cool caustics effect, they're sort of lighting their whole scene and they're not able to direct this light where they need it. Now, that's where IES light textures come in. So it's important to think about that. But if you want a sort of like quick solution to this sort of effect here, let's set the light back to 0 by hitting Alt G. So you can see the light went right back there to the 3D cursor. And what we're going to do is if we have the add-on that allows us to create this beam builder here, so it's one of the built-in add-ons, you can find it inside of Blender, so you can add that. But if we add this beam builder here, you see it makes this little box, okay? And if we look at this from the side, and we scale this down to the size of our light, like this, and let's scale this on Z just to have it, more of a box shape. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a constraint where we're going to track to the cube like this. And we need to actually alter this here in a minute, but we're going to do that after some stuff moves. So let's also add a parent-child relationship. So we're going to make this a child of the sphere. And that sphere is the light. So if we grab the light and we move it, you can see that the little box that we created for the sort of like laser effect, you can see that it's moving around with it as we move the light. And if we select the beam and we change this track to here, and let's move this here. There we go. So make sure the track 2 is below the parent-child relationship here, and then set it to -YZ. And just for fun, let's also click on the target Z. And if we move the sphere around now, you can see that it tracks to our cube. And if we look at the rendered view here, you can see that now the light is being directed straight into that object. So we don't have the entire scene being blown out of proportion. If we turn off the beam here really quick, I'll show you. So you can see that we have all of this stuff going on here where everything's lit up. But if we turn that beam on, you can see that it's very, very easily just tracking directly to that object, and it's directing the light beam right down in there. Now, what this does do is you're going to see that it has a lot of little, caustic fireflies all over the place, and that might work for what you're doing. And if we move this around, you can see how cool the sort of like lighting effects can look if you're, being creative with where you're setting that light. And it's fun to just play with that. But I will tell you that in my experimenting, I did notice that this did make it a lot harder to render your scene because there's all these fireflies and stuff. But it does look really, really, really cool. One thing to note is that when you're building your materials, on the materials, you'll see right here, there's this smooth right here. If you click that off, it will actually set hard edges. So anything that you put into the scene and you're using these materials, just make sure that you're checking for that smooth option there, because you'll notice that a cube or something like that, if you have that selected on, it might not have the look that you want. Now let's switch this up really quick. We're going to take this cube, we're going to call this glass cube, okay? And we're going to turn that off for now. And what I'm going to make is I'm going to make an icosphere, and we're going to move this up right here. And we're going to track this, instead of the glass cube, we're going to track it to this icosphere. And we're going to make a new material, and this one is going to be called metal. Because what's really cool about this new Photon kernel is that it also will allow you to use, and we're just going to add a metal material here, so metallic material, put that into the surface here. What it does is it allows also and you can see how it's all smooth here, so let's turn off the smooth. It allows metallic materials to also reflect caustics. So if we turn on allow caustics, you can see, bam, there's all of this reflected light going on, and we can move this around and bring it closer and just take a look at how the caustics are being reflected onto the scene. So that is a pretty cool thing, that as far as the option, it makes metallic materials look a lot more realistic because it properly reflects the light. And if you have text or something like that that should be reflecting those light caustics, it's really, really neat. And if we move this over here and duplicate this and put it right here, you can see that as we rotate this around, you should see some of those caustics. If you look really close right here, there's this sort lighter material, this lighter caustics right in here. If we rotate this around, you can see that those actually move. So the light is directionally hitting this object here, reflecting off, hitting this object, and then reflecting those caustics down. So it can get really complicated as far as the caustics effect that you want to have in your scene, but it allows you to just have fun with creating some cool lighting effects and caustic look. So one more thing really quick, let's just turn these off, and I'm going to add another icosphere, and we're going to move this up here, and I'm just going to call these icosphere metal 1, and we're going to call the other one metal 2. It's so metal 2. And then this one we're just going to call dispersion. And if we take this, we make a new material and add a specular material to it like this. We can add a dispersion coefficient of 0.044, which should be something like a diamond, and an IOR of 2.4 something, I think. I am not sure. I don't remember if that was the diamond setting. And click on allow caustics, and you can see that we have some really interesting stuff happening. Let's turn off smooth, and you can see that now we have that really, really cool effect where we have the dispersion shooting off everywhere along with this reflected light here. And I want to use this to just talk about some of the camera settings. So let's go to solid mode. We're going to save this, go to the camera, and let's actually move this down a little bit and grab the camera. And I'm going to set it like this and change the target of our track 2 here to the dispersion. Let's change this to render region like this here. And I just want to talk about just some of the render settings really quick. So what you need to know is that in order for your final render to look like what you see in the viewer here, what you need to do is hit N, go to the Octane setting right here, and then right here where it says Octane Camera Imager, click this on and then click on Override. Okay. And what that's going to do is everything that you're seeing here is going to be reflected in your actual render. And the next thing that we'll want to do is just take a look at the render settings for our kernel. So if you look down here, you can see we have the photon tracing on for kernel type. And basically, if you change this to the kernel node tree, you'll see all of these things there. And also you'll go to this right here. It says Octane kernel. And you can have different kernels set for like, however it is that you're trying to render your scene. But let's just ignore that for now. So a lot of this stuff is very normal. So the samples, obviously, if you need more samples for glossy, diffuse, and scatter, you want to do that. Caustics blur, basically, when you have something like this, it can be really, really difficult. So you might want to change the caustics blur to something like a 0.1, which will help get rid of some of those fireflies. But with this setup, the way that I have it with the beam, you're going to get some of those anyway. It's just part of how it renders, and that's why I recommend using IES light textures when you're trying to do something complex like this here. GI clamp, basically 10 is what Cycles usually has to begin with, so you can set that if you'd like, or you can right click and set that to the default value and just leave it for now. And let's take a look at some of these other things. So here's where the settings get a little bit complex, and I'm still experimenting with a lot of these, but I just want to talk about some of these items right here. So if we zoom in a little bit on the left here and you take a look at the photon depth, if we turn this down to 2, you can see that a lot less is being rendered. And sometimes you have to reset the render viewport over here for it to actually show what should be there. I'm not sure why that happens, but sometimes you'll see some of it render and then it disappears. And you just have to reset your rendered view. But you can see there that when we put it to 2, we get a lot less. And if we move this over to 16, we get a lot more. Did you see how it just went, dark? So just reset the rendered view there. So you can see that there's a lot more going on. It's going to take longer to render, but you get a lot more dispersion effects that can look really, really cool. And the best way that I can explain most of these is that you're basically sacrificing speed for quality. And I'm going to select this material here, and we're just going to talk about a couple things. So if we turn on accurate colors, what it's going to do is it's going to try and show the more accurate color refraction of your objects. So if I change the reflection quality here, and if I change the transmission here, and if I added a, let's say, a absorption medium right here, and made this a 1 and made this a green color or something like that. What that is supposed to do is it's supposed to be showing the more accurate colors. So if I turn that on and then turn it off, what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to show more accurate representation of the colors. I haven't seen that much of a difference with this, but I might be not as observant, but you might want to do some render tests to see how accurate that is. But we're going to leave that off for now. Then you can see right here the photon gathering radius. And this one's more easy to see. So if I turn this all the way up to a 1, you should be able to see some interesting like disco colors going on. And basically those are like large patches that are being brought in to show what those caustics look like. And if we take this and move it down to a 0.001 or something like that, what it's doing is it's basically sampling really small pixels of information and then saying, okay, let's grab those areas and keep rendering some of those areas around it so that we can represent what those caustics look like. And if we change this back to the default value, you can see that the pixel size as it's getting those, the little points of light are larger. And the more samples you get, the more solid it becomes. So I have done some testing and the default is pretty nice. You could put this down to a 0.0075, but the default works pretty well here. The photon count multiplier, and a lot of these you can just hover over and it kind of tells you what to do. It says approximate ratio between photons and gamma rays. If you move this all the way to the left and you take a look at it and you move it all the way over to the right, to that 8 right there, for me, I don't see that much of a difference for it really to matter. It seems like if you go to the left more, you get more accurate colors, but it might take a little bit slower. But I just keep this as the default. And the same thing here, the photon gather samples. If you move this all the way over to 64, What it says that it does is basically the higher value gives you more samples, but the quality is not as good. And if you move it all the way over to the left, you get like kind of like less samples per second, but it's more accurate, if that makes sense. So a lot of these things, you're just going to have to check some of these settings and compare the renders and see what you think about this. I'm just going to remove these because it might be causing some issues, and I just kind of want to see how this is being rendered over here. And then you have the exploration strength. If you move this all the way down to 0 and you take a look at the render, you can just, take a look at what it does. So exploration strength down to 0 looks kind of like that, which is really noisy. And then all the way up to a 1, it seems like it's rendering it a little bit faster. And if we take a look at this, we can just sort of make a comparison and see what works the best. So let's just set that back to the default value. And in general, I would say just start off with the default stuff and keep it there and make it look really nice. And I think you'll end up with something that you really, really like. And once you're ready to render it out here, you just hit F12 for the render, and you can see that the color space is the same as the viewport. So if you notice that this is darker, go back into the video where I talk about how to turn on the settings over here in the viewport to match your viewport and render color space. So that's going to be it for this tutorial. Hopefully you learned something. And what I'd like you to do is if you could just leave a comment down below and let me know if you're using Octane and if you like it, or even if you haven't yet, but you're looking forward to using it. I'm not sure if I should do more videos on this particular engine that goes into like procedural textures and stuff like that. So please leave a comment down below if you're interested, and I will see about making those videos. If you like what you're seeing here, please throw me a like. And if you want to be kept abreast on all the new stuff that I make, definitely hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you know when the new stuff comes out. Thanks so much to all of my YouTube members and subscribers and to my Patreon community. You guys are super awesome. Thank you so much, and I will see you all next time on DJ Tutorials.